as we're around Thanksgiving time, I definitely want to make sure that I'm respectful of everything. So I'm trying to resist the temptation to tell a dad joke today. But sadly, I just can't quit cold turkey.
Never quit, Martin. Never quit. Hello and welcome to The Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot button topics in the wine and food world. I'm your host, Catherine Cole, joined by co-host Martin Reyes, a master of wine, international wine consultant, winemaker, importer, and educator. Hello, Martin.
Hey, Catherine. We are lucky enough to be joined today by two prominent members of the wine industry who are Indigenous Americans. I've been fighting for equal opportunity and representation in the wine industry for some time, and I'm honored to have them on so we can highlight their meaningful work. First, I'd like to welcome Elaine Chukan Brown, a celebrated international wine educator, writer, speaker, and illustrator, and she was named Wine Communicator of the Year in 2020 by the IWSC. She's written for a vast array of influential wine books and other media. Her work has been covered across the globe, and to me, most crucially, she recommended the podcast microphone that I'm using for the Foretop. I figured if it's good enough for Elaine, it's good enough for me.
Awesome.
And next we have Tara Gomez, winemaker at Kitá Wines in Santa Ynez Valley, and also winemaker and owner of Camins to Dreams in Santa Rita Hills. She has touched and influenced brands that many people in the audience have probably tried, like Fess Parker and J-Lore, and has also traveled the world learning her winemaking craft through Europe, Spain, France, and Germany. Tara and Elaine, so wonderful to have you both here with us.
Thank you.
So happy to be here. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, I can't wait for this conversation. Thanks for that intro, Martin. Yeah, let's get to know you two a little better. I mean, what fascinating panelists we have today, Elaine and Tara. You're both so accomplished and successful in the wine industry. And our listeners may be familiar with you from the SOM TV. For those of you who aren't familiar with SOM TV, just check it out online. SOM TV, that's SOMM. There's an episode in the Vertical series that focuses on Tara's work, and Elaine is the narrator. And it's one of those things, it's half an hour for me. I was just like sobbing and laughing. It was just like so moving and emotional. And I just wanted our listeners to get to know you a little better. Perhaps both of you could introduce yourselves, not just in terms of your work, but also your background. So Tara, tell us which tribe you were a member of in California.
Yeah, so thank you for having me on. So I am from the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. So we once occupied our ancestors from all the way up north, Paso Robles, so all the way down south through Malibu.
Wonderful. And Elaine, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm born and raised in Alaska. My family's from here all the way back. Both my parents come from coastal peoples. So my dad's side were Inupiaq, which is northwestern coastal Alaska based. And on my mom's side, we are both Unangan and Sugpiaq. And the Unangan and Sugpiaq people are all island-based people. So the Aleutian Chain and Kodiak Island on my mom's side.
Very cool. And the pronunciation, there's no way I could have done that. It's actually, it's really beautiful because we don't hear that kind of sound in English. So thank you. So I'm curious to hear from both of you what it was like to enter the wine industry. You know, a lot of us get into the wine industry and feel a little alienated, and we feel like we don't have much of a community. And for the two of you, that must have been just magnified. So I'm curious to hear what it was like for you to get into the wine industry. Elaine, maybe let's start with you.
So to give perspective on my entrance into the wine industry, I have to very quickly go all the way back. So I am from a fully native family in Alaska, but my parents wanted us to be able to go through a mainstream education. They actually both grew up in native boarding schools. And so the situation they had was to go to school, they had to leave their home and leave their families. And they didn't want their children to be in that situation. So we wintered in Anchorage so that we could go to a mainstream school and live with our families. And then in the summers, we would go out to the Western coast where our native communities were. And so I grew up spending about a third of the year on the coast, but we would migrate in order to be at school, but all together at the same time. So in a funny way, I kind of grew up in two different worlds and also between two worlds at the same time. And the effect of that was that I'm really very used to feeling out of place. And so entering the wine world was in a way consistent. I felt very out of place. But what I've found is that if I feel out of place, if I just shift my attention to being curious, then that's a way for me to realize I don't have anything to prove. I have a lot to learn. And so I can shift my attention to what do I have to learn and being curious. And I've discovered that by approaching things in that way, people become very welcoming and really willing to help me learn. And so that's really the way that I found easiest to enter the wine world. That said, I was very out of place as a Native person in the wine world. And, things have changed a lot in recent times with being more interested in welcoming people from very different backgrounds into wine. So that's been a really surprising and interesting shift. I found, though, too, I did feel out of place in wine, but at the same time, people were very curious to learn about my background. Alaska is one of the places anywhere in the world people want to hear about. And so I really used that to share a lot about my background and really help try to bring attention to Native peoples, using my personal experience as a way of helping people be more aware of the reality of Indigenous life and Indigenous peoples in the wine industry at the same time.
Yeah, I guess that is a wonderful thing about the wine industry. I mean, in many ways, it can be intimidating to enter it, but when it comes down to it, it is social, and we all sit around and sip wine and get to know each other. So, Tara, can you tell us a little bit about getting into the wine industry and what that experience was like for you?
It was difficult from the very beginning, going to school, Fresno State, and entering into the enology program. There was like 100 students that first started into the program, but by the time I was graduating, there was only 12 of us and only 2 of us women.
Wow.
So that was really tough, and not being able to connect with people similar to me. I really kind of struggled with that, and then also too, just not really having the support group to help me out when I first entered into the wine industry. And so I pretty much had to do a lot of it on my own and really just believe in myself and be able to be successful and to get through it and to forge my own path, because that was really all I had. It was pretty difficult for me in the wine industry.
And I'm curious, what did your families and fellow tribe members think? What was their reaction when you said, I'm going to get into the wine industry?
Oh, well, my tribe was very supportive of that. I mean, they helped me go get my education through Fresno State. They helped me financially with all of that and getting educated. And and my parents, most importantly, like they've been my strongest support group, always there with me through every single step of venturing into the industry. When we were younger, I remember we used to go wine tasting with them, and we used to go on the wine tours when they were there tasting, and so that's how I actually started in wanting to get into the wine industry, was through the love of science.
That's a positive story. That is awesome to see that support. And Elaine, something that I've heard you say in the past is that there's also a not so positive story when it comes to a lot of the stereotypes around alcohol and Indigenous people. I can kind of relate to that. My own family relationship was tricky with it. My father was an alcoholic, and the very unique personal family dynamic where going into wine, my mom was like, why are you you're going to become an alcoholic, you're going to destroy yourself. You know what I mean? There was that resistance as well. And I know you've talked a little bit about some of that friction between Indigenous communities and alcohol and, of course, wine.
Yeah, I think it comes from both sides. So on the Native side, a lot of communities are really afraid of alcohol because, like you were just saying, some family members have really suffered with alcoholism. But in the broader public, there's a real stereotype that assumes that Indigenous peoples are alcoholics. The results of a study released decades and decades ago now that claimed to have found that Native people were immediately susceptible to alcoholism. It was a poorly done study. The results were not at all accurate, but the perception completely stuck in the public imagination. It is actually not true. Alcoholism numbers are not higher in Native communities, but there's this kind of belief that the numbers are higher. And so a lot of Native peoples are really protective against that stereotype and that perception. And you know, the truth is that Native communities all around the world have faced so many different kinds of hardships from outside groups that the idea that we could harm ourselves through something like alcohol is horrifying, you know? And so for a lot of people, it's like, well, let's just not touch it at all. And that way it won't be a risk, you know? I was lucky that my family, at least, the truth is they don't really comprehend the work that I do at all. Like, they have no sense of what on earth does Elaine do. But there, in this other way, I've always emphasized that, you know, I am Native. My work is thanks to my family, and I mean generations of family. I have like always presented myself that way in my work and to my family. And so even though they have no clue what I'm doing, they see me as successful and feel that it's their success. And that, as a Native person, like, that's fundamental to the culture that I grew up in, the idea that my success is thanks to my people and my family. And so I'm really grateful they do feel that.
Well, so Elaine, you brought up the issue of having to deal with ignorance and misconceptions. And I'm sure that you've both had to deal with some pretty frustrating stuff in the wine industry, a lot of misconceptions. And on the one hand, I kind of hate to have to ask you about this stuff, because the two of you probably have to answer a lot of questions like this, and it puts this onus on you that is not talking about wine and is not talking about winemaking, which is really what we all want to be talking about. But Tara, I understand that you've had the experience of interacting with a professional wine buyer who wouldn't even taste your wine because of your tribal background. I'm wondering if you could tell us about that experience.
Yeah, actually, that seems to happen a lot here in the Valley, the Sinus Valley. It just, you know, there's just not support for our Chumash tribe. And so a lot of the buyers are a little scared to bring in our label because they're afraid of what the customers may think, that they're supporting us. Or the other idea is that they think because we're owned by a casino that we have plenty of money and that they don't need to be supporting us, but that's not even true either. And so it's just a lot of misconceptions in that sense of either being scared to support us because they're afraid of what the customers may think, or because of, they think that they just don't need to support a tribe.
It sounds to me, I mean, you just can't help but make a link between that and the shockingly poor job that the U.S. does in educating citizens, right, about our indigenous people and the cultures. And so whether it's fear, whether it's some sort of recalcitrance, or what are my customers going to say, I mean, all there is around that is more curiosity. Mm-hmm. Should be more education, right? There should be more awareness of this entire subject. It should be normalized, I think, to a degree, and maybe that would go a long way to erode those misconceptions.
Mm-hmm. And then also too, they think that because it is what they call casino wine, that it's bulk winemaking, but I mean, it's totally opposite of all of that. And so, yeah.
The truth is, though, like, a podcast like this is part of spreading awareness, you know, because it's, when we say education, we have to be careful to emphasize it can't only happen in schools. We do need to improve public education in the schools, not, you know, every single grade, K through 12, and university and grad school. The history of the United States is based in indigenous lands of North America, right? And so that means it should be foundational to our public understanding of the history of this place. And guess what? There are millions of Native peoples alive right now in the United States, and even more if we include Canada and Mexico. And so it should be part of the public conversation. We are part of the American populace. But that means education, K through 12 and university, and the media have a responsibility. The media has done a very poor job at reporting Indigenous news, which is happening every single day. And we have to just keep sharing these stories to help keep increasing awareness and understanding. And so thankfully, something like this podcast conversation is one small way to help do that, you know.
And Elaine, thank you. You sent us some materials to prepare for this episode. And I realized I've been using some of the wrong terminology because it was what I was reading in the news. And I also grew up close to the Canadian border, so I have always used this term First Nations, which I realized only later that it's a Canadian term. It's not a U.S. term. But, you know, the fact that we don't, you know, those of us who really mean the best, we just don't know the terminology because what we're getting from the newspaper is incorrect, is just very frustrating.
It's a great example of how any one of us isn't enough to solve the problem. Like, we each have to do our part, but we need to keep pushing for it to be a public responsibility. Yeah. You know, because we can't do enough study on our own for all of these various issues. We need to increase the interest, you know, through newspapers, through radio, through podcasts and TV, but also, again, through public education. Like, it needs to be part of our culture because Native peoples are a foundational part of our culture. So it should be normalized, as Martine said.
You know, Elaine, you're absolutely right. I'm thinking it takes so many, it takes a chorus of voices, and also to raise awareness to things that are not necessarily obvious to the rest of North America that they would think are overreactions about things like the appropriation of the indigenous imagery, right? That a lot of the wine industry, and not just the wine industry, many industries, many consumables, many products for sale, that they are co-opting, whether it be for us in the industry, for the wine labels, the words and the wine titles, and the appropriation.
Yeah, so I actually have done a lot of work around the world, even working with other wineries around the world to help educate them on kind of the harmful effects of appropriation. It seems like a really simple thing, right? Like, it's like, oh my God, this image is so cool. I just want to use it. I relate to it. Let me make it my winery's symbol.
Right.
But actually the negative effect is that if you take an image, a symbol, or a ritual, or something that is central to another culture, and that culture is underrepresented, they have a harder time getting attention and being heard. And you take a symbol out of that culture and use it for your own advantage and your own, you're actually making it even harder for them to be heard, and making it even harder for others to recognize when that unique culture is communicating, because you've taken something integral to them and proliferated it in a way that has lost the meaning for those first peoples. So it's you know, and I could keep going on, but I want to hear Tara's perspective on this as well. But that's like one simple piece of, for people that are underrepresented, taking their imagery and using it for your own advantage seems like a simple thing for you, but it makes it even harder for them to be heard and recognized when they have that challenge already.
Yeah, it actually, you know, I saw it firsthand with Kitá Wines and using one of our names, one of our Chumash names, to name one of our blends. And I'm not going to mention the winery, but we got a cease and desist letter for our own name, our own Chumash language, one of the names that we wanted to use. It sounded too close to the name of that winery. So I had to go and scratch off all the labels for that particular instance. So yeah, that's a fine example of, you know, trying to use our own, you know, our own words to describe a label, and somebody else has one similar to ours that you know, we couldn't use our own.
That sounds incredibly frustrating.
If there was greater understanding of these things throughout the United States, then the law would be written in such a way that if the word or image is integral to your language or culture, you would have primary right to use it. Like that would be an appropriately written law, but we would have to have a legal system that is interested in respecting cultures of various sorts, including the ones indigenous to the United States.
It's ironic that we all go around telling people to stop using the word champagne unless they're using it in the context of champagne. And yet a lot of American wineries are using indigenous terms and not even thinking twice about it. I mean, this is an issue that people in the wine industry should be aware of because we talk about it a lot in reference to wine regions.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That hardy Burgundy, you know.
Right.
And, you know, it's interesting because I think people who are in the wine industry think that they're, I don't want to sound snarky, but evolved and their heart is in the right place and they are choosing that term or that image because they're coming from a good place and they want to honor, I'm putting air quotes around that, the tradition that term or image came from. But that explanation isn't enough, right?
Yeah, Tara, your example highlights it. If that winery was using that term for some reason that, you know, their heart was in the right place, and yet somehow they inadvertently almost erased that word and that meaning for you, that's not. There should be that awareness, and as Elaine mentioned, an interest by a system that protects that which is meaningful and vital, both culturally, historically, for indigenous people. We could talk a little bit also about switching gears a little bit about the history of fermented beverages in North America. Before any of that, whether there was U.S. and Canada and Mexico, there were the American continents were populated by indigenous people long before there was Alaska Native, First Nation, Mexican Indian, American Indian, right? So I almost don't want to qualify what I'm talking about when I say the fermented beverage history in the Americas and alcohol, the fascinating story that I think is worth diving into briefly.
Well, I'm super interested in hearing your views of it from, Martine, from your part of the world too. Because I mean, so in what's now North America, we have actually found archaeological evidence that there were fermented grapes being transported in clay vessels. Let's see, it would have been the 1400s, 1300s. As early as the 1300s. And so long before settlers from outside, the recognized European settlers arrived, or explorers arrived. Essentially every indigenous culture in the world had some kind of fermenting process. My peoples in Alaska have a lot of fermented foods, but we didn't actually have fermented beverages. But I know, that archaeological evidence that we found, it's like really that those border areas around New Mexico, that we found some of those sites. So Martine, I'm curious too, if you know much about the history from Mexico with fermented beverages.
The beverages that I am familiar with, and I haven't done my deep level of education as I probably should, but to me, the familiarity around the two beverages, pulque and tepache, that come from, and the pulque in particular is a stronger version of beverages, and the tepache is actually based on pineapples, and there's almost not, it's fermented, but in a very soft, mild way. You could even even kids could drink it. It's minor, it's almost refreshing during the day. It's not really intended to intoxicate you, whereas the pulque was more of a portion around religious and tribal experiences to heighten some level of awareness.
So up in Alaska, we fermented all kinds of stuff, but it's all the kinds of things that most people are scared of. So it's like stinky fish, stinky eggs, like, so the idea is like we would ferment all our different meats. So like fermented seal meat, fermented fish, fermented seagull eggs, like lots of things like that. But these were all just different ways of preserving the foods. And, Martine, you were talking at one point about fermented pineapple juice. And I almost feel like, I'm sure that's just a way to make the pineapple last longer too,
Probably, yeah. And the corn too, the huitlacoche, that's black and kind of smoky, earthy, kind of mushroomy, probably also to make the foods and the beverages last a little longer. One can hypothesize, I believe.
So you're both talking about these long traditions of fermented beverages, and yet there is this idea, for some reason, that Indigenous Americans have a particular problem with alcohol. And I think, Elaine, you were talking about this earlier. And there's actually, I just want to mention, there's a new book by Mark Lawrence Schrad. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It's called Smashing the Liquor Machine. And it's a whole new spin on the prohibition movement. And it talks about alcohol around the world being used by sort of predatory leaders to subjugate underprivileged communities, everywhere from South Asia to Russia to Indigenous Americans.
Well, I mean, just to reframe that a little bit, I think it would be fair to point out that this same kind of practice happened in the historical UK, and even very recent history, so this is not just a way of leveraging power against different groups of color. It's like it happens in European and white communities as well, right? This is it's just another way of leveraging power. And I would even say that the huge issue with opiate addiction in the United States, with meth addiction, a lot of people feel that that's just another version of the same thing. And that's rampant in white communities, right? And so this kind of abuse of intoxicants and using it against underprivileged groups, there's a long-standing history of that. And it's something that we can see happening all over the world, not just in places where it's being used against people of color, but it's about, a class structure and a way of getting people to do work for less money a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm. People in power basically pushing these products on people and making them addicted.
Well, because the addiction has two positive benefits, right? So one, people need to get a hold of them. So that creates a money machine by selling these intoxicants. But it also means that people need to get the money to buy them. And so it's really easy to keep people doing menial work, which is like just enough to live on and buy the intoxicants, right? So it kind of, when people are addicted enough, they also are often less able to advance. Not in every case, of course, but it can have, really negative impact on people and yet make other people a lot of money.
Well, it is time to take a little break and taste some wine from our fantastic sponsor. I've got Rachel here, and we have cracked open a bottle of the 2019 Grand Moraine Yamhill Carlton Oregon Pinot Noir. I'm excited for this wine because I'm a big fan of cool vintages, and 2019 was notable in that it was the coolest harvest season in the Willamette Valley since 2007. And 2007 is an underdog cool vintage that I still adore to this day, so I'm super excited for this wine. Let's give it a try, Rachel. Let me know what you think.
I really like this. I am also a big fan of cooler vintage Pinot Noir. I think this has this kind of like sharp, like bright red raspberry thing, which I really love, and also like kind of more savory notes, like that kind of raspberry leaf, maybe some spice in there. I love this.
Me too. It's earthy, it's delicious, and it definitely reflects that Yamhill Carlton AVA. It was aged 9 months in 39% new French oak, and winemaker Shane Moore vinified 25% of the fruit as whole clusters, which builds in some nice spice and structure into that wine. It was crafted from fruit grown on estate vineyards on the wild western edge of the Yamhill Carlton appellation. Both of the estate vineyards contain some of the oldest marine sedimentary soils in the greater Willamette Valley. But don't take our word for it about this beautiful wine. Check out the gorgeous Grand Moraine Winery next time you're in the area. It's located in the heart of the Willamette Valley in the town of Yamhill. Make an appointment to visit the next time you're in the Portland area. Or have a Grand Moraine delivered right to your home with free shipping. You can use the promo code FOURTOP to get that. That's FOURTOP. Go to granmoraine.com. That's GRAN, Gran Moraine, MORAINE. To purchase your wine online, enter the promo code FOURTOP and you get that shipping on the house. Thanks so much, Grand Moraine.
Let's move on to our final broad topic, and the fine wine industry is very much identified with the concept of land ownership, that owning that perfect vineyard estate, with the ideal terroir, right? Terroir for the audience is that sense of place that comes through the grapes that then you can taste in the wine, right? Whereas most indigenous cultures don't think of land as something that can be owned. I have a personal awareness of a story down in Valle de Guadalupe that I can touch on in a little bit. But first, I wanted to bring Tara in because I wanted to see if you can tell us a little bit about that unique ownership model behind Kitá, right? The first fully tribally owned and grown and made wine in North America.
Yeah, so our tribe was recognized as the first Native American winery to have a Native American winemaker and have everything run solely by our tribe. Recognizing that, yes, this is, to recognize the land of where, indigenous people come from, because that's a part of our history. That's a part of our culture. It represents us. It's a part of us. So yes, to me, that's super important.
I think part of what's unique with it too, Tara, if you don't mind me adding to that, is just that indigenous culture is really around the world is pretty commonly defined by a unity of people and place. So it's an identity that in many ways operates differently than a lot of other ethnic or racial groups do. And so, as an example, there are a lot of really fantastic wineries that are racially, have an owner who's a person of color. An example would be Theopolis up in Mendocino is owned by this gorgeous, wonderful, super fierce, intelligent Black woman, Theodora Lee. I totally adore her and her wines. And so you could say that that's a Black-owned winery because it's owned by a Black woman. But part of what's unique with in question of indigenous ownership is that what we're really talking about is being owned by a group. So Kitá is owned by the tribe. In British Columbia, Inkamip is owned by the Osuyus band. And so these are tribally owned wineries, and that's really foundational to claiming they're indigenous owned. Whereas Camins to Dreams, I love Tara and Maria's wines, and they really deserve to be celebrated. And I would say that is owned by an indigenous person, which is it's very subtle, but in my mind, an important distinction that connects to what it means to be indigenous. Indigenous people very much tend to identify with their group, and the group is defined by its place. So it's the two together.
Can I ask, does it ever bother either of you when you hear, I feel like I hear this in Oregon, someone whose family, they have, like a century farm or a pioneer farm, and they say, my family has owned this farm since the beginning, and now I'm growing grapes on it. I'm the original owner. My family are the original owners of this property. And I think, no, I think that this, first of all, the concept of ownership didn't even exist for the people who inhabited the land prior to your family. But yeah, I just, something about the wine industry, there's this connection to who owns the land and it's sort of this bragging right thing. And I'm just curious if that bothers you, hearing that sort of terminology.
Yeah, it like I said, it just goes back to, for me and my ancestors and for, the land that my ancestors once occupied. We are the original stewards of the land. And so yeah, it does send a little bit of a mixed message for me in listening to that.
I think it just goes back to, what we were talking about earlier in terms of public awareness and education. Someone could have the absolute best intentions. And of course, there's really a sense of pride that I know a lot of people, when they make these kinds of statements, they're so proud because their family has been there for so many generations. And I want to honor that. I want to say, no, it's a wonderful thing to be able to celebrate that you've been here for 5 generations or however many generations. But at the same time, we have to be thoughtful about how we word that, because claiming to be the original family or the original owners is unquestionably an erasure of the peoples that really created this place. And as Tara so beautifully put it, stewarded this land for so long. And so we can celebrate. I'm so proud to be a multi-generational family, and I want to honor that before we came, these tribal groups were here. You know, we can do both. And I think actually for the health of our culture in the United States, it's important to learn how to do both. And we can just practice it by simply talking about it in both ways. You know, it's okay to be proud that your family's been in a place for so long, and we can have that pride while honoring the people whose land this was, and in many ways still is. We're just all here together now.
You know, the situation is being played out a little bit in Valle de Guadalupe, down in Baja California, where there's about 1,000 indigenous Kumeyaay people. It's one of the 5 people in Baja and the Ensenada municipality, where there is this growth around the wine route. There's an evolving wine route, and there's pushes and pulls of struggles between any development of any land with real estate, with lots of money, and with the promise of the wine idyllic lifestyle and the money that comes along with that. But there's this lack of legal certainty that to prove that the Kumeyaay are legally owners of that land, and therefore they're relegated from decision making. Not to go back on this, but I think that we have to be aware when Elaine says the awareness, the education, not just in schools, that's one thing, but also within the culture of the Americas, US, Canada, and Mexico, to be aware that the indigenous population isn't in the past. It is very much in the present. It is part of our foundation. Mexico's too. There's 15 million people, indigenous people in Mexico. That's 14% of the population. It's not a past. They've been erased, but they still very much exist. Most of them in poverty, maybe half of them having gone to primary education, and they're the most vulnerable, therefore, in the face of inequality, right? So these indigenous territories, like in Valle de Guadalupe, the infrastructure projects, there's no consideration. We want there to be consideration. So I'm talking to the people who are developing the wine routes down there, and just starting to talk, because I'm obviously not a Mexican citizen. I was born in the U.S., but by bringing that awareness down and say, hey, we're paying attention collectively, right? The wine industry is paying attention. All the elements that we've encountered over the past year and a half, for the most part, that these territories and these cultures are at risk of vanishing, when in fact they should be celebrated as the original owners of what in the future might be called the new hot wine route in Valle de Guadalupe.
I think it just comes down to what are we prioritizing? Is our main interest in making money and pushing to develop a hot new wine region just because it's cool? Or are we going to balance development with taking care of people? What's our emphasis going to be?
It's funny because in the wine industry, we talk a big sustainability talk. We think we're the good guys. And to hear that the wine industry could be pushing some indigenous folks off their land is just horrifying. I mean, the whole point of wine is experiencing joy and sustainable farming and, enjoying people's company, all the good things. So it's very sad to hear this.
Well, and Catherine, you've been a champion of sustainable farming for a long time. Your book on biodynamics came out, I think, over a decade ago, maybe 2008 or so. And the thing that we're still trying to learn in the wine industry is that sustainability only exists because of people, and that for sustainable farming to actually occur, we have to be taking care of people through our farming. It's not that we take care of the land and then the people are a secondary thing. The things must be integrated. They must be integrated. That's what sustainability comes down to.
I'm going to tell you, I'm going to sneak peek you my dessert course, which is a documentary called The Intelligence of Trees on Netflix. Maybe I've got it wrong, but maybe Intelligent Trees or The Intelligence of Trees. And a lot of people are now familiar with the idea that trees can, they have families, they have friendships, that they have generational memories, they have fears, they have happiness, and that their systems have almost brain-like functions around the mycorrhizal fungi relationship. We know this in wine too. When you study this, right, we the regenerative farming and also the full ecosystem around this, we know that the majority of plant species, because we're in the wine business, will benefit from that mycorrhizal fungi relationship, that symbiotic relationship, and that there's a network of collaboration even amongst cross species. And so the industry itself as a whole went from quality, luxury, premium at all costs, right? Where it's almost this individualism, vintner all by himself or herself, almost this toxic individualism. We're coming back to recognizing, no, actually there's a much deeper beauty, right, around a system of cooperation, of collaboration, but from the perspective of a sustainable ecosystem, sustainable not just land, but also the people, not just people, but also the businesses. It's almost like the indigenous population in North America has always known that, and then we're just sort of all coming back around to being like, oh, you guys had it right the whole time, and we're just coming back to that. We're just aware for the first time as an industry. Yeah,
in northern Alaska, where my people are from, if you try to go it alone, you're going to die. Like, it's very straightforward. It's very, very straightforward, and this idea that competition is survival, like that, it's profoundly naive. Like, go to any part of the world and try and do it. Like, Thoreau didn't even do it. His mom brought him lunch every day. He just wrote an awesome book. Like, those are different things,
I think it's time to move on to our dessert wine course, where we each share something wonderful that we've been enjoying this week that may or may not relate to food and beverage. Martine, it sounds like you just shared yours. Is there anything else you want to say about that
I recommend people watch it because then that reshapes what you're thinking is of, you start looking at trees and forests like communities.
Sounds fantastic. I'll put it in my queue. Tara, did you bring a dessert wine item and just anything you'd like to recommend this week to finish off the show?
Well, I've been drinking a lot of bubbles lately. One of the latest was one from Recorredo. There in Penedez. It's not Cava region anymore, though, right? It's Corpinat. They just recently changed that. So yeah, I had a 2004 not too long ago.
That is some good wine.
That reminds me. What do you call a tribute band from the Penedes?
Are we about to get a dad joke? I can feel it coming.
Do tell, Martine. Do tell.
What do you call a tribute band from the Penedes? A kava band.
So good, so good. And I love that Recorrido. That's yummy, yummy stuff. Thanks for that, Tara.
Yes.
Elaine, did you bring a dessert wine item for us?
The thing that I have done recently that is like mind-blowing and cool, and I'm going to like give away an insider wine tip.
Here, do that.
I got to visit a vineyard in Anchorage that is planted in the ground and yet fully enclosed in a greenhouse, because I don't know if you all have noticed, but Alaska's cold. But it's a properly planted in the ground vineyard. It's just also fully inside of a greenhouse. And I got to, they grow Cabernet Zinfandel Pinot, and then also Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, Riesling, and Sauvignon Blanc. And they basically make a red wine and a white wine at this point because they don't have very much of any of those vines. So I haven't had the red wine yet, but I had the white wine the other day, and it is properly drinkable. I was like, holy smokes. Look at that.
Wow.
So it's, it's a whole new world.
That is super interesting. Oh my gosh. Dying to taste that. Dying to see photos. So I hope you post some soon. So my dessert wine item is, I don't watch a lot of TV, but I loved Schitt's Creek. And if you loved Schitt's Creek, I just went all the way through a series called Rutherford Falls. And I wondered if Tara and Elaine, either of you have seen this. Have you seen this series?
I haven't seen it.
No, I have not. And actually, I'm like you, though. I haven't watched a whole lot of TV.
Well, it's on Peacock, and it's interesting because the underwriting theme of the show is land ownership and indigenous communities, and it stars Jana Schmieding. I'm probably saying her name wrong. Jana Schmieding. She is an indigenous comedian, actress. She's hilarious, and the very dashing Michael Grey Eyes, who's very handsome and is also extremely witty. And it's just one of those series that you just can't stop watching because it's so funny. And yeah, I'd be curious to hear your reactions after you'd seen it, because I thought it was delightful, and I just loved the fact that, you know, two of the main characters are indigenous folks who are just trying to deal with the crazy rest of the world. So I recommend that.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much to our fabulous panelists. You were both fantastic. Listeners, you can find Elaine Chukan Brown online at wakawakawine.reviews.com. That's spelled WAKA, winereviews.com. And you can find Tara Gomez online at kitawines.com and also at caminstodreams.com, and that is CAMINS numeral 2 dreams.com. And of course, our co-host Martin Reyes is at reyeswinegroup.com. You can find me on theforetop.org or at catherinecole.com. But you know what? I want you to go to theforetop.org and figure out our social media handles and talk to us, listeners, because we want to hear from you. Please also subscribe to The Foretop on your favorite podcast app, and please leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts so that others can find us. I am signing out here from the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon, as always in my recording studio, also known as my kids' closet. And thanks so much for listening. Bye-bye now.
This has been the Foretop Podcast. Catherine Cole is our executive producer, Izzy Kramer is our senior producer, and I'm Keelan King, sound supervisor. We are also assisted by audio editor, Michelle Richards, our production assistant, Rachel Grossman, and our social media assistants, Lex Rule and Nick Toole. Please visit our website, theforetop.org, to learn more about us, listen to back episodes, reach out to us on social media, and purchase books written by our amazing panelists. And if you have not already subscribed to The Foretop on iTunes, NPR One, or Spotify, please do so and leave us a rating. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.
Oh, wait a minute. Are you still there? Oh, well, if you're still listening, then I need to tell you something. I need to tell you about the fabulous swag over at sparklingwineanytime.com. Sparkling Wine Anytime is, of course, your favorite new book about all things bubbly, but it is also a wonderful website designed by our team, Lex and Rachel, and we have gifts and goodies galore for you. We have sparkling wine-themed beach towels, teas, cocktail napkins, fancy wine flasks, adorable tote bags, and more. And guess what? Your purchase will help to support a favorite cause of ours, Ahivoy, that's AHIVOY, check it out, which provides education and career training to vineyard stewards in the Willamette Valley. So it's a win-win for everyone, and who doesn't love sparkling wine anytime? Please head to sparklingwineanytime.com. We would love to see you there. Thanks. We love you all. You're wonderful. Kiss, kiss.